For more than a century, a strange object carved into the walls of an ancient Mesopotamian palace has circulated across the internet under a name that sounds almost too modern to be real: the handbag of the gods. Winged, bearded figures, some with the heads of eagles, stand in stone more than 8 feet tall, gripping in one hand a small container that looks, from a certain angle, remarkably like a leather purse with a rigid handle. For years, that resemblance has fueled one of the most widely shared claims in alternative history circles: the idea that ancient Sumerian and Assyrian gods were depicted carrying advanced technology, some kind of device belonging to visiting beings from beyond Earth, and that the exact same object shows up thousands of miles away in the art of Mesoamerica, supposedly proving these visitors touched down on multiple continents and left the same calling card everywhere they went. It's a compelling story, and it has generated millions of views across documentaries, forums, and video essays. But when researchers who actually read the Cuneiform texts, these images come from, sat down and cross-referenced the carvings against the written record the Assyrians themselves left behind, what they found was not evidence of alien engineering. It was something else entirely, a detailed, textually confirmed picture of a civilization that lived in a state of constant, organized dread, surrounding its kings, its palaces, and even its sickbeds with an unbroken wall of ritual magic because it genuinely believed invisible, malevolent forces were trying to get in. Today, we're going to walk through exactly what that object actually is, what the cuneiform ritual texts say about why it was carried, why clay copies of the very same figures were deliberately buried inside palace walls and under royal thrones, and why the real explanation, once you understand it, is considerably more unsettling than the alien technology theory it replaced. Let's start with where this image actually comes from, because the details matter enormously here. The carvings people call the handbag of the gods were not created by the Sumerians, despite how the claim usually gets phrased online. They come primarily from the Neo-Assyrian period, roughly 900 to 600 BCE, more than 2,000 years after Sumerian civilization had already given way to Babylonian and then Assyrian rule across Mesopotamia. The most famous examples were carved into gypsum alabaster slabs lining the northwest palace of King Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, in what is now northern Iraq, and later examples appear at Nineveh and at Dur-Sharrukin, the purpose-built capital of King Sargon II, near modern Khorsabad. These winged figures line palace corridors by the dozens, repeated over and over in nearly identical poses, standing beside the king, flanking doorways, and clustered around a stylized image of a tree. When French and British excavators pulled these slabs out of the ground in the mid-1800s, shipping them first to the Louvre and later to the British Museum, they encountered something that had genuinely never been fully explained before, because the ability to actually read the cuneiform writing accompanying these images was still in its infancy at the time. If you've scrolled past a version of this claim on social media and wondered whether there was anything to it, you're exactly the kind of viewer this video is for. And if you find this kind of deep, source-based investigation valuable, go ahead and subscribe now, because unpacking viral archaeological claims against what the actual academic record says is exactly the kind of thing we do here regularly. So, what does the object in the figure's hand actually represent? Assyriologists, the scholars who specialize in reading Akkadian and Sumerian cuneiform, have known the answer for well over a century, and it comes directly from the texts the Assyrians themselves wrote to describe these very images. The object is called a banduddu in Akkadian, which translates simply and unglamorously to bucket. It is consistently held in the figure's left hand, while the right hand holds a second, smaller object shaped like a pine cone or a stylized date palm flower called a mullilu, which translates to purifier or cleanser. Together, these two objects form a single ritual gesture that appears hundreds of times across Assyrian palace art. The purifier is dipped into the bucket and then used to sprinkle the contents, whether that was understood to be sacred water gathered from mountain snowmelt or the fertilizing pollen of the male date palm flower onto a person, a doorway, or most commonly, onto a highly stylized image of a tree that scholars refer to as the sacred tree, a repeating decorative motif that shows up at the center of an enormous number of these palace scenes. This is not speculation built on a modern reinterpretation of ambiguous imagery. Vigerman's landmark academic study, Mesopotamian Protective Spirits, cross-referenced these palace carvings directly against a body of Akkadian ritual texts that describe, in explicit and repeated detail, exactly this gesture and exactly these two objects, using the same vocabulary the carvings themselves are labeled with in the accompanying inscriptions. The winged figures themselves have a name too, and understanding who the Assyrians believed they were is essential to understanding why this whole ritual mattered so much to them. They are called Apkallu, and in Mesopotamian mythology they were not gods in the way Marduk or Ishtar were gods, but something closer to a class of primordial sages, semi-divine culture heroes who were said to have emerged from the cosmic freshwater ocean called the Abzu at the dawn of human civilization, sent by the god Enki specifically to teach humanity the foundations of organized life. According to the Babylonian priest Berossus, whose account survives through later Greek sources, the first and most important of these figures, named Oannes, rose out of the sea with the head and body of a fish worn like a cloak over a human form, and proceeded to teach early humans writing, mathematics, geometry, law, agriculture, city planning, and temple construction, essentially the entire package of what the Assyrians and Babylonians considered civilization itself. 6 more sage figures followed across successive generations, according to the mythological king lists that survive on cuneiform tablets, each one paired with a specific antediluvian ruler, meaning a king who reigned before a catastrophic flood that Mesopotamian mythology describes in terms strikingly similar to the biblical account. Crucially, in the standard mythological framework, the Apkallu ceased their direct involvement with humanity once the flood came. They withdrew, according to the texts, back to the primordial waters they came from, leaving humanity to face the post-flood world without their direct guidance. That withdrawal is the detail that makes everything else about this story click into place, because it explains exactly why the Apkallu kept appearing in Assyrian art and ritual life for another 1,000 years or more after the mythological point at which they were supposed to have left. If the wise, protective sages who built civilization were gone, and if the world after the flood was understood to be a more dangerous, demon-haunted place than the world before it, then Assyrian religious specialists faced an obvious practical problem. How do you maintain the protection the Apkallu used to provide once the actual sages are no longer physically present to provide it? The Assyrian answer to that problem is exactly what the carvings and the buried figurines represent, and it's also exactly where this story stops, being a quaint mythology lesson, and becomes something considerably more disturbing. Cuneiform ritual texts recovered from the royal libraries at Nineveh and from temple archives at the city of Assur lay out, with almost bureaucratic precision, a set of procedures for manufacturing physical stand-ins for the Apkallu and deploying them as permanent functioning guardians. One of the most important of these texts is known by its opening words, Bit Meseri, meaning house of confinement, a lengthy incantation series that instructs a ritual specialist called an ashipu, essentially a professional exorcist and magical practitioner, on exactly how to carve small clay or wooden figurines representing the 7 Apkallu in either their fish-cloaked form or their bird-headed winged form, how to name each individual figurine, how to consecrate it through a specific spoken incantation, precisely where inside a house or palace each figure needs to be physically buried. The instructions are remarkably specific. Sets of 7 Apkallu figurines were to be placed at 5 distinct locations, at the head of the sleeping person's bed, inside the foundation of the building itself, at the threshold leading into the household chapel, in front of the main door behind where a person would sit, and in the middle of the room directly in front of the throne or chair. Each set of figures was accompanied by a spoken incantation that survives word for word in the texts, addressing the buried figures directly. You are the statues of the Apkallu, the Watchers, using an Akkadian verb that carries the double meaning of both watching and guarding. Here's where the archaeology and the texts line up in a way that leaves essentially no room for alternative interpretation. Excavators working at the Neo-Assyrian capitals of Assur, Nimrud, and Nineveh have repeatedly uncovered exactly what these texts describe. Small clay figurines, often still bearing traces of the specific poses and attributes the rituals call for, sealed inside brick-lined boxes buried in building foundations. Archaeologist John Curtis and Assyriologist Julian Reed documented a particularly well-preserved set recovered from Fort Shalmaneser at Nimrud, found sealed in their original undisturbed context, meaning archaeologists were looking at figures that had sat exactly where a Bronze and Iron Age ritual specialist placed them roughly 27 centuries earlier. Never touched, never moved, doing the specific job the incantation assigned to them for the entire intervening span of history until modern excavation finally broke the seal. Scholar Dessa Riddig cataloged dozens of these foundation deposits across multiple sites in a landmark 1977 study, and later researchers, including Stephanie Daly, confirmed the pattern holds consistently. Groups of 6 or more figures, packed into brick boxes, placed at precisely the locations the ritual texts specify. Think about what that actually means in practical terms for someone living inside one of these buildings. This was not a one-time decorative flourish applied when a palace was built and then forgotten. The presence of these buried, consecrated figures represented an active, ongoing belief that the structure itself needed permanent, embedded spiritual defense, that without it, something would get in. A related set of ritual instructions, known by the phrase Shep Lemuti Ina Bit Ameli Parasu, which translates roughly to blocking the foot of evil in a man's house, describes similar foundation deposits paired with other protective figures including composite beings like the Bullman and a lion-headed demon called the Ugalu, all working together as a kind of layered magical security system built directly into the architecture. Mesopotamian households facing illness, a run of bad luck, or a specific and identifiable demonic threat would commission these figure sets from a ritual specialist, and the specialist would then perform the burial as an active intervention, not a preventive formality, applied at construction and then never thought about again. If any part of this is genuinely new information for you, drop a comment and let us know, because this is exactly the kind of detail that gets lost when a single striking image gets stripped of its original context and passed around online purely for its visual resemblance to something modern. And if you want to see more breakdowns like this one, where a viral archaeological mystery gets checked directly against the primary source material, hitting that subscribe button helps us know to keep making them. Now let's connect this back to the monumental carvings lining the palace walls themselves, because the same underlying logic explains why the bird-headed Apkallu with the bucket and cone appear so obsessively throughout Ashur-nisirpal's palace at Nimrud, and why the imagery escalates even further under later kings like Sargon II and Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. The stone reliefs were not simply decorative reminders of an old myth. Scholars studying the placement of these figures within the palace architecture have noted that they consistently flank doorways, line corridors leading toward the throne room, and cluster densely around the most sensitive and symbolically important spaces in the building, exactly mirroring the burial pattern described in the ritual texts for the small clay figurines, threshold, foundation, and the space directly around the seat of power. The stone versions functioned as a permanent, visible, monumental scale extension of the same magical logic, operating underground in the buried clay figures. Every person who walked through those corridors, courtiers, foreign envoys, and the king himself, moved through a gauntlet of purification, sprinkled symbolically over and over by carved sages performing an endless, frozen ritual meant to seal the entire palace against demonic infiltration around the clock, forever. That escalation over time is itself worth pausing on, because it tells you something about how this practice functioned within Assyrian royal ideology. Under Ashur-nisirpal II in the 9th century BCE, the bucket and cone Apkallu appear extensively, but within a relatively restrained visual program. By the time of Sargon II's newly built capital at Dur-Sharrukin, and especially under Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, roughly 2 centuries later, the imagery becomes considerably more elaborate, with the Apkallu integrated into sprawling garden scenes and royal propaganda imagery that explicitly links the king's cultivated order domain, his conquests, and his divine legitimacy directly to this ongoing magical protection. The kings of Assyria were not simply commissioning art that referenced an old story. They were commissioning what amounted to permanent monumental spellwork, cast in stone at enormous expense, specifically designed to broadcast to everyone who saw it that the empire's security rested not just on its army, but on an unbroken, professionally maintained barrier against the supernatural. This is also where the philological detail about the cone matters more than it might first appear, because scholars have genuinely debated exactly what substance was being sprinkled and why, and the disagreement itself reveals something important about how thoroughly ritual and practical concerns were intertwined in Assyrian thought. One line of interpretation, based on the term mullilu, meaning cleanser, and its association with purification rituals elsewhere in the textual record, holds that the bucket contained consecrated water, possibly specifically water gathered from mountain snowmelt to the north of Assyria, treated as sacred precisely because it fell from the sky and originated far from the ordinary rivers of the Mesopotamian floodplain. A second line of interpretation, based on the object's consistent visual association with the stylized sacred tree and its resemblance to the male flower spathe of the date palm, holds that the entire gesture represents artificial pollination, the ritualized fertilization of the sacred tree using pollen gathered from male date palm trees, a practice that has obvious real-world agricultural roots, given how central date palm cultivation was to Mesopotamian food security and how genuinely necessary hand pollination is for reliable date palm fruiting. Rather than one interpretation definitively displacing the other, most current Assyriological scholarship treats these as complementary rather than competing. Purification and fertility were not separate concerns in Assyrian religious thought, the way they might be treated as separate categories today. Water that purifies and pollen that generates new life were both, in this worldview, expressions of the same underlying concept. The Apkallu's ritual tools maintained cosmic order by keeping both spiritual corruption and physical barrenness at bay simultaneously. So where does the actual alien technology claim fall apart under this evidence? And why does the claim persist anyway despite well over a century of published, publicly available Assyriological scholarship directly contradicting it? Part of the answer is straightforwardly visual. A rigid, handled container held in one hand does superficially resemble a modern handbag if you strip away everything else in the image and focus purely on silhouette. And pattern recognition of that kind is a powerful, largely unconscious cognitive shortcut that does not require any actual connection between the two objects to feel persuasive. The claim also leans heavily on the supposed appearance of the exact same object in Mesoamerican art at sites associated with the Olmec and later Toltec civilizations in Mexico, which is presented as impossible to explain through coincidence alone. But when scholars specializing in Mesoamerican iconography examine these specific images, the objects identified as matching handbags are generally understood within their own well-documented cultural context as something else entirely. Ceremonial bags associated with copal incense, ritual bundles containing sacred materials used in bloodletting or divination rites, or symbolic containers tied to specific Mesoamerican deities and creation narratives that have no textual or archaeological connection whatsoever to Mesopotamia. Mesoamerican civilizations developed these traditions independently over centuries within their own religious and agricultural context, thousands of miles away and separated from Mesopotamia by an ocean and, in the time frames usually cited, by more than 1,000 years. A bag-shaped ritual object is not, on its own, a particularly unusual or improbable thing for two unrelated civilizations to independently develop, given how common bags, pouches, and containers are as basic technology across every human culture that has ever existed, and given that both regions independently developed sophisticated ritual traditions involving offerings, purification, and fertility, the underlying human concerns that produce ceremonial bag-shaped objects in the first place. What actually happened here is less a story of forgotten alien contact and more a story of a specific, well-documented category of human cognitive bias, sometimes called pattern matching, or apophenia. The tendency to perceive meaningful connections between objects or events that share superficial similarities but no genuine causal relationship. It's the same underlying tendency that makes people see faces in clouds or hear hidden messages in music played backward, and it becomes especially persuasive when applied to genuinely ancient and mysterious-looking imagery, because the visual strangeness of Assyrian art to modern eyes creates a kind of blank space that alternative explanations can rush in to fill, particularly when the actual academic explanation requires reading translated cuneiform ritual texts that most people, understandably, have never encountered and have no easy way to verify for themselves. And this is exactly why the real explanation, once you actually sit with it, ends up considerably more unsettling than the alien artifact theory it replaced. The ancient astronaut version of this story is, in its own way, a comforting one. It suggests that ancient people were depicting something genuinely extraordinary because extraordinary visitors had actually been among them, wielding real, tangible technology that simply looked strange to primitive eyes. It's a mystery with a clean, external, almost reassuring solution. We just haven't figured out the physics yet. The documented reality is stranger and darker because it requires no external visitors at all. It shows a sophisticated, literate, mathematically advanced civilization, one capable of building multi-story palaces, managing an empire that stretched across the ancient Near East, and maintaining one of history's great libraries at Nineveh, simultaneously living in a state of genuine, institutionally organized terror of an invisible world it believed was actively hostile and constantly probing for weaknesses in the walls, under the beds, and behind the thrones of even its most powerful rulers. The kings who commanded Assyria's armies and administered its vast bureaucracy did not consider themselves safe inside their own palaces without professional exorcists on staff, without carved stone sages standing eternal watch in every corridor, and without small clay guardians buried and sealed into the very foundations beneath their feet. Incanted into permanent, active duty against threats their religious system insisted were real and were coming. It's also worth sitting with what this tells us about the emotional texture of daily life at the very top of one of the ancient world's most powerful empires, because it complicates any assumption that political and military power translated into a corresponding sense of security. An Assyrian king who had just returned from a successful military campaign, having personally overseen the conquest of rival cities and the expansion of imperial territory, still walked daily through corridors dense with purification imagery, still slept in a room with guardian figures buried at the head of his bed, and still relied on a standing class of professional ritual specialists whose entire job was managing an ongoing, unseen conflict that never actually ended. The Apkallu were not called upon once during a crisis and then forgotten. They were maintained continuously, generation after generation, an unbroken chain of buried figurines and carved reliefs stretching across centuries of Assyrian history, which tells you that whatever fear originally motivated the practice never meaningfully subsided across that entire span. That is the discovery that sits underneath the viral handbag claim once you strip away the science fiction framing, not evidence of visitors from another world, but a remarkably well-documented, textually confirmed portrait of just how thoroughly the fear of the unseen shaped the architecture, the art, and the daily private rituals of even the most powerful people in the ancient world. There's a broader lesson embedded in how this particular claim spread and persisted, one that applies well beyond this single Assyrian bucket and cone, and it's worth spending a moment on before we wrap up. Genuinely ancient civilizations left behind an enormous volume of specialized, technical, and often genuinely strange-looking material. Religious texts, ritual instructions, mythological king lists, and monumental art created for audiences with completely different assumptions about the world than a modern viewer brings to the image. Reading that material correctly requires years of specialized training in dead languages and a willingness to sit with genuinely alien belief systems on their own terms, rather than translating them instantly to whatever framework feels most immediately familiar. The alternative, treating an unfamiliar ancient image as a kind of visual Rorschach test onto which modern anxieties and modern technology can be projected, is faster and often more emotionally satisfying. But it consistently produces exactly the kind of story we've been examining today, one that borrows the genuine mystery and age of the source material, while discarding almost everything the source material actually says about itself. The real Assyrian ritual texts were sitting in published academic translations, publicly accessible in university libraries, and increasingly online, the entire time the alien handbag theory was circulating and gathering millions of views. The information required to correct the claim was never actually missing. It simply required someone to go looking for it. So what should you actually take away from all of this the next time you come across a striking ancient image paired with a confident claim about lost technology or extraterrestrial contact? It's worth asking a simple set of questions before accepting the claim at face value, starting with whether the civilization in question left behind its own written explanation of the object, and if so, whether that explanation has actually been consulted. In this specific case, it had been for well over 100 years by scholars whose entire careers are built on reading exactly this kind of material accurately. It's also worth being skeptical of claims built primarily on cross-cultural visual resemblance alone, since the human visual system is remarkably good at finding similarities between objects that share no historical connection whatsoever, particularly when the objects in question are as visually simple as a container held in a hand. None of this requires dismissing genuine curiosity about the ancient world. If anything, the real documented answer here is considerably more fascinating than the alien technology version. A functioning, textually verifiable magical security system embedded into the architecture of one of history's great empires, still sitting exactly where ancient specialists buried it nearly 3,000 years ago, waiting for archaeologists to finally break the seal. Well, what do you think is more unsettling? The idea that ancient civilizations were visited by advanced beings we still don't understand? Or the documented reality that one of history's most powerful empires spent centuries in genuine organized fear of an unseen world it believed was constantly trying to break in? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read through every one of them, and there's consistently sharp discussion happening there from people who clearly know this material well. If you want more deep dives that take a viral ancient mystery and actually check it against the primary sources, subscribe now so you don't miss the next one. Share this with anyone you know who's fallen down an ancient aliens rabbit hole online, and we'll keep digging into the real texts behind these claims as more of them come across our radar.